Welcome to Sunne Pustak. This is an audiobook channel. Thank you for joining me today. It's been a long time since I recorded or posted any audiobooks. So here we go. In today's episode, I will be reading one story from the book Tilled Earth by Manjushree Thapa. The title of the story is 300 rupees. And let me tell you, I also haven't read this before, so please join me. Rohit's eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing much. A haze of trees, a blur of blocky buildings, the yellow-blue hues of dawn, Kathmandu. He was tired of the way the bus rattled his bones and sick of the two prattling women behind him who had talked non-stop throughout the night. "Look," one of them said now, as they passed a vast, tarred lot filled with colorful cars. "It's like a garden made of metal." "All those lamps on the road," said the other women, "and they won't give our village even one bulb? And look at those houses, they are all offices. So many offices. What do people do in them? They sit at table and claim to be developing our country. Look how wide the road is. So many motor cars. Where do they go at night? To the stalls of their owners?" The bus swerved sharply and shuddered to a halt. Rohit stood up, anxious to leave. Was this the bus park? Outside the windows was a row of buses. Yes. He looped his black and white book bag across his shoulders and jostled past the other passengers as they were standing up. A woman clucked, "Ch," as he brushed against her. "What's the rush?" someone groused. He paid them no mind and sidled up to the conductor, a boy of about 12, with a smile too sly on his lips. "Open the door," he urged the boy. "Why don't you open the door?" The boy kicked open the door, and out stepped Rohit, dressed in a wrinkled blue tunic, traditional close-fitting trousers, and a flower-patterned cap, and Chinese cloth shoes that sold for 75 rupees in the village. To stave off Kathmandu's blistering fog, he had worn a black waistcoat and a scratchy muffler. His face was dark, and his hands were rough from farm work. He noticed that his breath was a white evaporating cloud, and everything smelled of greased machines in the nation's capital. He walked to a large building with square glass windows and stopped in front of the door. A row of buses was parked there. Some of them were local, he knew, and others went all over the country. A shiver of pleasure at the vastness of the world swept through him. There were so many places he hadn't been to. The horizon full of farmlands in the south, the clipped, tidy tea estates in the east, and beyond that, India. Everyone and their sons went to India to work these days. He approached an emerald green bus. A young man was standing beside it. "I needed to get to a place called Chhatrapati," Rohit said to him. The young man, who was wearing very high-quality modern jean pants, pointed with his chin across the road. "Chhatrapati bus is over there." Rohit looked across the road. There were no buses there, just a row of three-wheel auto rickshaws. Still, the young man had sounded sure of himself. So Rohit made his way over to the rickshaws, stopping at the first one. He said to the driver, "I needed to get to the place called Chhatrapati." The driver was wearing dark glasses. He mumbled something that Rohit didn't understand, then leaned back and pushed open the canvas door. Rohit climbed in head, arms, and legs first. "Close the door," the driver said, and Rohit obeyed. The inside of the rickshaw was lively and with red and yellow linoleum mats. The walls were plastered with pictures of naked women. Rohit's first thought was how shameful. What if he had come with his wife or daughters? How humiliating that would have been. Shyly he examined the pictures. One particularly salacious drawing had a naked woman holding a giant cigarette between her legs. The rickshaw started up with a roar and lurched on to the road. It steered itself out of the bus park and towards the city, which was hidden behind the fog. Rohit vaguely remembered this stretch from the first trip he had taken to Kathmandu last year with his brother. It had been like this then too. Trucks and buses had showed up suddenly and disappeared into the fog. Coming for a visit? The driver shouted above the racket of his rickshaw engine. Rohit hummed, slightly hesitant to talk to a man who kept pictures of naked women in his rickshaw. But he was a gregarious temperament, so he couldn't help adding, "I've got relatives here." "Your son?" The driver leaned out and spat, and Rohit saw the saliva streak past him. He too leaned out and spat. The wind whipped his face. He drew back and said, "My brother. He moved here a year ago." "I've got a son," the driver said, "studying at the campus. Day after day I drive past his dormitory, but don't stop to see him. Know why?" He turned back briefly, giving a profile view of his dark glasses. "His friends would laugh because I'm a rickshaw driver. Imagine that. Can you imagine that?" Rohit clucked. Unthinkable. Is that how a son should think? The rickshaw swerved into a narrow alley. Is that how your own son should think? Rohit's infant son in the village was all laughter, cries, gurgle, shit, and piss. "That's not how a son should think," he said. "How many sons do you have?" "One," Rohit said, "and 4 girls." "Where?" "Just outside Dhorfirdi." The driver shrugged. "In Tanow district," Rohit said. "An hour off the road. Driest patch of land you ever saw. Can't farm a crop." The boss stopped right at the bridge of Dhorfirdi. The rickshaw puttered to a sudden halt. "Here's Chhatrapati," said the driver. Peering out, Rohit saw that they were hemmed in all sides by narrow cement buildings. "Oh," he exclaimed. "Look at all these houses. How will I find my brother? Who are all these people? Do they live in these houses? Look at the girl with white hair. What happened to her?" "She's a foreigner. 42 rupees. 42? What I said when you got in." "Preposterous. 1.50 rupee," Rohit cried. "That's how much it's meant to be. I came here last year and took a similar rickshaw. Don't think I don't know anything." "This is a private rickshaw," the driver said, turning back to glare at Rohit through his dark glasses. The glasses gave him a menacing, insect-like expression. "Look at that meter. It says 42 rupees. That's enough to feed a whole family." 40 then. "Taking advantage of innocent villagers," Rohit complained, but he realized there was nothing to do but pay. He took a long time finding a 50 rupee bill and waited morosely as the driver counted change. A thief of a place, this city, and so noisy, so full of people whose heads bobbed up and down the streets. He looked again at the white-haired women and wondered why, if she was foreign, there was a ring in her nose. The driver nudged him to attention, handed back a bill, and leaned back to open the door for him. Rohit hadn't quite stepped out when the rickshaw revved up again and chased off after a car. He took a firm hold of his black and white book bag and looked around. He must find a rest spot with a green tin awning. Green tin awning, he'd been told. Young men, old men, women of all ethnicities passed by with a swirl of colors. "Look," Rohit said to himself, "middle-aged women wearing pants." Then he saw across the road a high covered platform at the center of traffic, and it had a green tin awning. Chhatrapati. He stepped towards it and felt a warm, soft body and the sudden metal edges of a bicycle. "Don't you have eyes?" someone yelled. A horn honked. A few cars swept by. A large man shoved him off the sidewalk. Rohit waited till the road was completely clear and ran through safely to the covered platform. A few men were lying down on the platform's bare cement floor. Tch, how cold they must be, he thought. By their features, he thought they might be tamangs, porters. They were holding on to ropes to carry their loads with. Rohit squatted down beside them, trying to imagine the life of a city porter. It would be like trekking company porters, only they would be carrying chairs, desks, cupboards from truck to truck, shop to shop, one merchant to another. What would make a man want to live that kind of life? A flood in his village, maybe, or landslides that wiped away his house and fields. Some of Rohit's fields had been destroyed over the last monsoon, but the gods had blessed him and his brother with a whole hillside of terraced farmlands, parts of which he had just sold at his brother's insistence. The fog seemed to thicken, and a silver mist rolled through the street, swirling along with the commotion of the street. The cold of the platform stiffened Rohit's bones. He drew his muffler over his nose to savor the warmth of his own breath. A long time, maybe an hour, passed as he distracted himself with the sights that passed before him. Why, he wondered, did motorcycle make such a racket, while cars glided by so silently? How much would all the signboards on this street cost to make, combined? If everyone all over Nepal stopped farming and came to the city, what would people eat? "Uncle," he heard eventually, and turned to see a thin boy dressed in a blue school uniform standing a little way off. It was Keshav. "Nephew," he said, standing up. "Come and pay your respect to your old uncle. How tall you've grown. How like a city boy." He held out his hand in blessing, but noticed a reluctance in the boy's motion as he bowed. "Where's your father?" Rohit asked. "How far is his shop?" The boy pointed vaguely towards one of the intersecting roads, then began to head towards it. Rohit followed him. "What do you have in that nice school bag?" he said, trying to win the boy's affection. "Books that teach you English?" But Keshav said nothing, slipping so fast through the crowd that Rohit had to hurry to keep pace. "You must be the tallest boy in your class," Rohit called out after his nephew, but Keshav just ducked into a dark, unpaved alley. At the end of the alley, they reached a temple. There, the alley opened up to a large, heavily trafficked pitched road. An ambulance raced by on it, wailing like a widow in grief. Rohit stuck close to his nephew as they darted through the traffic across. On the other side was a pavement full of street vendors, selling shirts, caps, peanuts, vegetables, and fruit. Keshav stopped and pointed further up along the sidewalk. "There's Baba over there." And there he was, Narayan, sitting at the center of concentric display of bananas. Narayan saw him and lifted a hand. Rohit noticed that his brother didn't rise in greeting, let alone bow, when he walked up to him. He tried not to mind this oversight. His brother had lost the tanned complexion of a villager, and his face was as pale as wheat. His hair was combed back and oiled, and he wore a fancy acrylic sweater and impressively clean trousers of terry cotton. The transformations people go through in a year. If it weren't for the dent in both their noses, Rohit thought no one could tell that they were the same father's son. His nephew had disappeared, and for a while, Rohit just stood on the pavement, hovering over his brother's concentric display of bananas. "Sit," Narayan finally suggested, and so Rohit squatted beside the bananas, holding on to his book bag. "Sit more comfortably," Narayan insisted with a hint of annoyance in his voice. So Rohit gathered together his blue tunic and settled into the gritty pavement. His brother, he saw, was sitting on a straw mat. The protocol was all wrong. Pretending not to notice this affront, Rohit turned with a keen, interested expression to study his surroundings. A dim sun was finally glowing through the fog, putting a glint in the glass, steel and mica city. The building across the street had windows like dark mirrors. On the road, there were so many cars packed together, inching along like a metal snake. "Where does that go?" Rohit asked, pointing at a manhole cover, then answered his own question. To the sewers beneath, of course. When fashionable ladies walked by, he noticed. Their high-heeled shoes clacked against the pavement. He finally turned to his brother. How much do your bananas sell for? I take what I can get. Narayan's tone was flat. Do you want some? Are you hungry? So early in the morning, Rohit demurred, too proud to admit to hunger in the face of such lack of ceremony. He smiled wanly. Nobody eats at such an early hour. Did you bring the money? This is why Rohit have never liked Narayan. His brother didn't have the least courtesy. He didn't show any consideration for anyone. He was crash. He was greedy. It had been like this since childhood. His brother had been the spoiled, overindulged younger child. Rohit reached into his book bag and took out a roll of banknotes. 15,000, he said, giving it to Narayan. That's your share. With a sly innuendo, his brother said, I heard land was selling for twice this much at Kairini. Are we Kairini? Rohit snapped. Has the government dug a road all the way to your house? Have they brought us electricity? He watched Narayan tuck the money into his acrylic sweater. You forget our fields are mostly sand, and with the landslides last monsoon. Narayan sank back on his straw mat, his face spoiling. Everyone thinks, he spat out, that I have it good in the city. I'm earning. My wife's earning. My son's in school. I don't have troubles of my own. He gestures contemptuously at the concentric display of bananas and seemed to want to say something more, but didn't. Rohit could hardly believe what he was hearing. Are you suggesting I'm cheating you? He reached into his black and white book bag and pulled out the land sales deed, signed by the secretary of the village development committee. He waved the paper in front of his brother. Look for yourself and see how much money I've robbed you of. Thousands and thousands of rupees. Instead of bowing in shame, Narayan grabbed the paper and began to look over it. The gull of a boy. Had he forgotten all the time Rohit had washed him, fed him, clothed him, mended his pants, defended him from bigger boys, sheltered him from their stepmother's wrath? All the times he had taken the cows to graze so that his brother could attend school. It was Rohit's sacrifices that had made Narayan turn out so smart and city slick now. Rohit wanted to remind his brother of all these sacrifices, but just then a woman came up to the display of bananas, all fluttering nylon sari and flowers in her hair. Narayan put aside the sales deed and sold her a dozen of bananas. Both brothers watched as the woman walked mincingly away in her high-heeled shoes. The flowers in her hair, Rohit saw, were of plastic. Narayan finally handed the land sales deed back to Rohit. For a while, both brothers sat huffed in hostility, the expression equally hard. Rohit eventually started to shiver from the cold. He shifted and coughed to cover the sound of his stomach growling. Finally, Narayan mumbled something about tea and got up, and went to a nearby tea stall. Rohit watched his brother waiting in line to buy tea, and he suddenly felt filled with remorse. For some reason, it was sad, this sight. Where was his sister-in-law? Where had his nephew disappeared? Why not invite him to their dwellings and serve a proper meal there? Rohit was himself keen to see their lodgings. Built of cement, it would surely be better than the old clay hut in the village. Narayan came back with 2 glasses of black tea, which they both sipped in silence. The hot drink soothed the cold and eased Rohit's hunger. It also seemed to soften the expression on Narayan's face. Presently, Rohit asked, And Keshav's mother, where is she? She works at a factory. Narayan's tone was conciliatory. Otherwise, she'd cook a meal for you in our rented room. What kind of rent do you pay? 1,000 a month. 1,000? Rohit felt a pang of guilt about the 8,000 rupees he'd kept for himself by forging the land sales deed. 8 months of rent in his city. He gulped down the rest of his tea, suddenly wanting to get out of Kathmandu and return to his own Dorfirdi. I should get back to the bus park, he said. His knees cracked volubly as he stood. There's a meeting tonight about the broken irrigation canal. I mustn't be late for it. Of course, Narayan didn't insist he stay on. He actually looked relieved. I'll show you the right bus, he said. He took Rohit by the arm and led him further up the pavement to a four-way intersection. There he showed him to a battered blue minibus. Sit next to the window so you can see where you are. Get off at the bus park and ask at the ticket booth. Rohit hoisted himself onto the minibus. The front of the bus was empty, but the aisle was crowded with nubile girls in starched college uniforms. It would be awkward to push through them to get to those seats. So Rohit remained by the door, clutching a window bar for support. Dai? Narayan called out from the door, reaching in to slip some soft money textured notes into Rohit's hand. You must be... I couldn't even feed you, and the bus fare. Such a long trip, he said. There are restaurants by the bus park. Embarrassed, Rohit shoved the money into his book bag. Then a man clambered into the bus, knocking against Rohit. Room, I need some room, he said. Can you move a little? Once on board, he reached down and pulled up two bleating goats. Rohit pressed against the side of the bus to make room for them, then followed the man and his goats past the nubile college girls. At the front of the bus, he took a window side seat. He turned back to wave at Narayan, but it seemed that his brother had already left. The man with the goats sat across the aisle from Rohit. Rohit looked over the goats. Such goats, he said appreciatively as the animals bleated. Are you going to sell them in the bazaar? If I get my price, the man responded. Only if I get my price. And how much will this one go for? He pointed at the bigger goat. The man reached into his coat pocket and took out a cigarette. I'll take what I can get, he said after he lit up. 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200, depending. 1,200. Rohit leaned over and plucked a hair from the goat's rump. The animal bristled. He inspected the root of the follicle. There isn't even that much fat on it, he said. I'll take what I can get, the man repeated. The smell of his cigarettes made Rohit realize how hungry he was. The man's muffler was of the same scratchy material as his own, but cleaner. The man's pants were of thick black wool. He was wearing shoes but no socks. Or no, he was wearing socks, the same color as skin. The bus started up with a rumble. Rohit sat back in his seat, examining the skin-colored socks. If he hadn't looked closely, he wouldn't have seen its fine ribs. As the bus lurched onto the road, Rohit was suffused with a sense of mystery at all the things there were in cities like this that looked one way but acted differently. All the fronts and illusions. Look at Narayan. The boy was so rude, so coarse, but he knew in his heart that he owed Rohit everything. He knew he owned his elder brother his whole life. In his heart, Narayan knew. He didn't show it, but he knew. How could he not know? Rohit checked in his book bag to see how much money his brother had given him. 300 rupees. 300 rupees. He counted again. 300 rupees. Was that too much or too little? As the bus lurched on its way, Rohit turned to the owner of the goats. How many meals do 300 rupees buy in this city, our nation's capital? So that's the end of 300 rupees stories. I must say I really liked it. It showed the differences between, city area and villages, how the lifestyle is, and the nature and the concrete cement in the city, and also, the tension and differences between two brothers, but then also thinking about themselves, thinking about each other. I really liked it. Comment below if you like it or not, and if you'd like to hear more stories. Thank you. See you. Bye.